The midnight of so-called independence in August 1947 and the birth of two nations, India and Pakistan, have led both to never-ending border skirmishes, wars, hate-mongering, and prejudice from the very start. Underneath the celebrations of this so-called independence, if anything in a meaningful way, there were rivers of blood-laying, millions uprooted, and the silent cry of an ancient civilization torn apart. Partition was not just the division of the land. It was, as I call it today, the soul murder of a nation. The world was going through an entirely changed landscape. The heat of the Second World War was cooling down and transforming itself into a Cold War, but yet another war. Among the Allied winners, the Great Britain found itself at the bottom and the United States at its top. UK was unable to continue its rule over India. The British Raj was essentially done. US replaced UK to continue its fighting against the Russians. The US and USSR both emerged from the war as two great powers. Both were on the opposite sides of each other. UK kept getting weak and weaker. Soviets and Americans were continuously fighting each other somewhere in the world through most of the last century, however, never head-on and only through their proxies. India and Pakistan both offered themselves as useful pivots. Both were on the opposite sides of each other, as were the two great powers. One had to oppose the other because of their bad economies to maximize their benefits. It became so painful at times that the loss of one was seen as a virtual gain of the other, and vice versa. The Cold War finally ended in 1989 with the Soviets' loss in Afghanistan. The US then emerged as the sole superpower. Pakistan was jubilant along with the US, which immediately imposed sanctions on it to curtail its nuclear program. Ironically, India shared Soviet griefs regarding its loss to Pakistan and not so much to US. The two countries of the subcontinent became absurdly silly. Partition was not just the will of the people. Politicians and priesthood all along have done a huge disservice to the people of India and Pakistan. UK did this for its own reasons, and it could have stopped it. It had some tacit support from the Indian National Congress Party, which too could have not let it happen. Muslim League, being the smallest and the weakest of the three, kept looking for its own right place to protect the future of India's Muslims and was largely reactive as it suited. The time before the partition was also the time when the Cold War between UK and USSR was very much alive and more on the British side. It couldn't have just left India in one piece without having any control over it afterwards. Rawalpindi, even then as it is today in Pakistan, was the armed forces general headquarters of the United India. An invasion by Soviet Union in Afghanistan was always in the cards, which ended up being a real scene 35 years later in 1979. It was deemed more practical to control divided India than united. 20 years earlier, annexation of Armenia and Azerbaijan by the Soviets to expand their defenses against the West wasn't forgotten by Prime Minister Winston Churchill as yet. The Brits had to carve out their own such territory within India, and the one without any Indian control, of course. Oil and gas fields in the Arab world had already been discovered. Indian rupee was the prevailing currency in some of the Middle Eastern Gulf states. Hindus capitalists had their eyes on the newly found oil wealth. An emerging, however small, industrial base in India foresaw the value of energy in the form of gas and oil. A decade earlier, in the 1930s, community-based awards and rewards were established by the British Raj. Hindu-Muslim hatred was fostered, facilitated, and magnified. Upper caste Hindus were becoming rich and richer, whereas 90% of India remained cruelly poor, and that was regardless of anyone's religious beliefs. Here, the low caste Hindus were piled up right next to Muslims along with the other minorities of India. India didn't have any practical, effective, or an educated middle class. India and Pakistan both are about the same even now, except that both have a sedentary kind middle class, but one without any teeth. The attitudes and the ethics of the rich are about the same as they have ever been. The trickle-down effects of the national wealth are still minimal. The governments are ineffective, controlless, and rampantly corruptive. No one can fix it until we get rid of this current electioneering system. But that is besides for now. We will address that and the alternatives in our future programs. India before the partition was largely controlled by newly emerging rich and richer industrialists, plus the princely states Rajas, Maharajas, Ranis, and Maharanis, which included both Hindus as well as Muslims. The tensions between the two communities were not all that significant. Little that there was, it only was a wash because there were also unique, friendly, neighborly, and cordial relationships side by side in a day-to-day living and doing business as usual without even thinking who's who. However little or more that the money India had, much of it was in the hands of the upper caste Hindus, who also excelled better in the fields of education. Muslims, on the other hand, considering their population numbers disproportionately, were the real face of India. Food, dresses, songs, poetry, music, radio, broadcasting, cinema, celebrations, and so on were mostly Muslims, but not necessarily Islamic. Actually, quite Hinduic, or call it secular. The only meaningful foreign relationship India had outside its borders was with the Muslim Middle East. The accepted language in the armed forces was Urdu, known commonly as Hindustani. The English-speaking British Army officers as well as bureaucrats were required to learn Urdu academically. That is the reason that this language is comprehended in most part of India and Pakistan even today. Pakistan after the partition got the best of the subcontinent's geography, and India got the rest of the best of the United India. Both became pivots to US and USSR after 1947. Pakistan got some extensive hands-on experience in the process as envisioned by Premier Churchill. It became so good at it that it was pivoting on both sides of the wicket at times. Subsequent violent and dangerous wars cost all parties, including Pakistan. The damage of partition in both countries continued non-stop and to this date, and the changed landscape of mid-40s started turning again for another big change yet. The first 2 decades of the century 21 has done it all. The longest American war in Afghanistan, where a huge financial loss was realized by the US for the first time ever. Simultaneously, another power was silently focused at its own discrete mission behind the scenes to eventually emerge as another great power, the third ever, the China. We will be talking regarding the emergence of this third great power in our future programs. India as well as Pakistan both have borders with China. This is imperative that this troika get along with each other 3-way across. This is another hugely changed landscape, uniquely different and with a great opportunity for the both, India as well as Pakistan. China has and wants friendly and practical relations with all countries in the world, and that is how majority of the countries have it with China. India and Pakistan both have a host of opportunities in the offering and in the region, and waiting to be benefited from, but only together and not separately. Central Asia, the least globally engaged patch of the world, is more resourceful, Muslim majority, like the Middle East. We lost Middle East to the West because of our partition. We shouldn't have to lose this Central Asia. This is another great opportunity, perhaps even better and more resourceful. ASEAN group of countries have done a great job striking an excellent balance between America and China coupled with Russia. We will be talking about this region as a whole, comprised of South Asia, Central Asia, and West Asia, which essentially is the Middle East, in our future programs. This is all I have for now. I'll have my closing remarks in a second. Please don't leave yet. Thanks. Couple of more items in support of what I just said. China and India are two ancient civilizations, both thousands of years old, both with somewhat similar ethos. There is a difference though. China fought for its independence and India obtained its so-called independence as a result of several rounds of roundtable conferences with the Brits and by fighting from within. Secondly, right around when Indus Water Treaty was being executed in Karachi, President Ayub offered Prime Minister Nehru to have a joint defense agreement between the two. It is said that Nehru politely declined by saying that it will not be worth the piece of paper it will be drafted on. The people of India and Pakistan both have a rarely matched ability to absorb education, knowledge, and technology. The political leadership and the priesthood in both countries have failed its people miserably. Societies in general have roughly 10% of their citizens of integrity and intelligence at the top and 10% at the bottom. Whichever 10% outperforms the other 10%, 80% end up following that 10%. We are being led for a long time by the 10% at the bottom. Among the fault lines, the system of governance is at its core in both countries. It is still colonial, and corruption has virtually become our subculture. Lastly, just as did China, India too had revolutionary forces who were willing to fight for India's independence as they saw it right to keep India united. Subhash Chandra Bose, Bhagat Singh, Allama Mashriqi, Allama Iqbal are just a few among many others. There was even an incident of a serious mutiny by the sailors of the Indian Navy in 1946. Dr. Sir Allama Iqbal, the distinctly famous poet and a great philosopher of the last century, this is what he had to say regarding the naiveness of Indians about 90 years ago in 1935. And things are not much different or better today either. He wrote, "Na samjhoge to mit jaoge Hindustan walo, tumhari dastan tak bhi na hogi dastanon mein." O the people of India, if you will not comprehend the damage being done to you, you will vanish to exist. And not only that, there will be no story about you to tell the world. And you will even cease to be as a reference. You will even cease as a reference to in the stories of others. Allama passed away in 1938. He also said in another one of his poems, "Sare jahan se acha Hindustan hamara, hum bulbule hain iski ye gulistan hamara." Our India is the best in the world and we are its nightingales, and this is our floral garden, the garden full of flowers, our Hindustan. Prime Minister Nehru once remarked, had it not been for Pakistan, Allama Iqbal would have been the national poet of India. I wonder why he couldn't be the national poet for both. Thanks. Shukriya. May God bless us all.